We're going on a journey into the darkest chasms and caverns of the mind, deep down into the unconscious. We find a shadowy labyrinth with innumerable winding gates and alleys. At the center of the maze, we find a door, ancient and ornately carved with symbols and hieroglyphs from the earliest dawn of man. Do you dare? Perhaps you'd better not. Don't open the door. I wasn't always this criminal you see before you. I wasn't always this evil. I used to be one of the good guys, if you can believe it. You probably think you're one of those good guys too, don't you? I won't let that go easily. I can't in good decency let you walk away after admitting that. Have you ever faced true temptation? Right at the point you were at your lowest. I mean real temptation. Not like that brownie pie with ice cream on the second day of your New Year diet resolution. Let me try an angle here. Everyone reads the Bible and thinks that, like Jesus, they would go into the desert and resist the 3 temptations of the devil, as well as the 4th temptation, the one on the cross. In the reverse, not too many people read Genesis, and when they see the snake offering Eve the temptation to plunge all of humanity into the pit of sin and degeneracy, think to themselves, you know what? I got a lot in common with that snake. I'm a regular belly crawler. Or better yet, man, I think I was born to have lived in a different era. Perhaps I would have fit in at Sodom or Gomorrah. Me, I am one of these latter types. Whether I like it or not. This is just plain old-fashioned honesty. Something I'm sure you're not accustomed to. And that's why I only used to be one of the good guys, maybe even better than you. Merely for the fact that I now admit that I've fallen. But after one has gone further, after one has fallen to the extent that I have personally done, well, calling me a good guy is no longer in the cards if the phrase good guy is to retain any meaning whatsoever. That's right. Unlike you, who has never tested their mettle against the multifarious dark forces of the universe that indeed are sitting on one shoulder, next to those better angels, every picosecond are processing spiritual matter in the fashion of Maxwell's demon, counting elementary particles, photons of the soul consisting of good and evil, like matter and antimatter, and opening the little gates and closing them, seeking to undo your humanity by slow, stepwise introduction of the most corrupt and blackened corpuscles into your being. After a metaphorical 40 days and 40 nights of fasting, I had to face 4 temptations myself. You will see that I am no messiah. I hope you are not expecting that. I'm a writer by profession. This isn't an easy gig. Let me break it down for you. You probably imagine a guy sitting around in his underwear, eating Cheetos and drinking wine all day while he plucks away at the keyboard and 1 or 2 of those burgeoning pussy zits on his forehead. At the end of all this self-gratification, this self-diddling, is the big advance check. Maybe 6 figures or more. Put out 1, 2, even 3 novels a year, and you've got all the wine and Cheetos you can handle, with likely a few more pimples on your ass to complement them. It's enough to make anyone jealous, but it's not quite an apt description. Just look what became of poor Hemingway. In fact, being a writer is hell. The worst profession you can possibly choose if you want to feel good about yourself at the end of the day. Except maybe a painter. But that's a discussion for another time. I might go as far as to say that I think writing is the loneliest profession, maybe even the deadliest. By definition, you have to do it alone. You can't think with someone else blabbing in your ear, and so you have to sit alone with your thoughts all day long, just waiting for the next piece of this pile of crap story to come to you. What could be worse than that? All this playing with yourself. For what? Sometimes I feel like they should just round up all the writers to be marched out behind the shed, blindfolded, and shot by a firing squad. Society might benefit greatly from such a thing. As a writer, I can say this without offending someone, but in reality, other writers wouldn't be offended because they know it's true. In vino veritas. Except, I haven't had any wine today, and unreliable narrators are the oldest cliché. That's why I only tell the truth anymore. I'm done with the lies that fiction tries to sell, and so I'm gonna tell you a true story this time. Something that really happened in Buffalo, New York last summer. It concerns how I became that bad guy I was telling you about. My whole career, I've always been telling myself that it's time to quit. It's time to hang up the pen and get a real job. People don't read anymore. They don't have the attention span or the patience. They're too addicted to TikTok and YouTube shorts. People have gotten dumber. They can't appreciate true art anymore. I envisioned that in Shakespeare's time, you had even the most uneducated peasants and working-class stiffs going out to watch the highest form of art humanity has ever known, likely not understanding at all just what the hell old Bill was yammering on about, but nevertheless drawn by the magic and mystique of the stage. Oh, how humanity has fallen. Now it's all mass-market horseshit. People want airport romance novels, and the worst kind of trash that floats up to the top of the New York Times bestsellers list. Unless you give them the most cliché hook in the first sentence, they send the book flying into the flames. Unless you give them something to embolden their grievances and satisfy their worst inclinations. All men are sexist. We had utopia before the white savage came along, etc. They'd use the pages for toilet paper. It's their fault my agent dropped me. It's their fault I haven't published in over 2 years, I said at the time. In reality, we all know how this story goes. I had writer's block. I had nothing left. I was trying to squeeze that last bit of mustard out of the jar, but it just wouldn't come out. It was as if I'd already said everything I had to say about life in the short career that I'd had so far. I was a boring person, so shoot me. What do you want? And so I lived off dwindling royalties, and those monthly checks seemed to be getting smaller and smaller each time. To make matters worse, when I'd first gotten published and started hanging out with the other elites, I managed to alienate all of my old friends, and these new friends dried up like the desiccated corpses their personalities emulated when my agent dropped me. Of course, I was perpetually single, seemingly incapable of making a relationship last more than a month. But that summer, I did have a girl who'd been hanging around for a couple of months. Nessie was her name. It was short for Vanessa, of course. Messie was my pet name for her, poor thing. She imagined she'd found love in, of all places, the arms of a failed, unemployed, maybe unemployable writer. Anyway, I apologize for all this nonsense. I think I'd better get to the point before it's too late. I think even now I hear the sirens off in the distance. How it started. How did it start? I do admit that a long time ago I was born, but I haven't the strength to go into that day of tragedy. Rather, allow me to fast forward again to that summer in question in 2016, the one I have already alluded to, before my strength fails me, or your tiny amount of patience falters, your infinitesimal capacity for understanding the truth causes you to look away in horror, and your non-existent ability to concentrate has you chasing your tail in front of me while I blather. Yes, let's do. It was hot and humid that summer. The thick sweat that hung in the air was enough to suffocate you in the tiny apartment I'd been rendered into after I'd gotten myself evicted from the downtown flat for lack of payment. On one particularly hot afternoon, I'd convinced myself to finally sit down at the laptop to attempt to write something. I hadn't done similarly in the past few months. The themes of my 3 previous novels had been highly literary, philosophical stuff. If you're curious, think David Foster Wallace was crossbred with Mark C. Danielewski. The fact that I can make such a description, no matter how infinitely it lacks, and how infinitely my novels actually fail to measure up to such a description, it just goes to show how unoriginal it all was. Recently, I'd somehow gotten the lurking feeling that I didn't have any future in this genre. What exactly spurred on these feelings, I couldn't quite say. It was rather just a gut instinct, you could say. But I'm sure the missed rent checks over the past year also had something to do with it. No one seemed to care for such mental masturbation anymore. The 90s were past, the grunge era of rock and even the post-grunge era had ended. And if I was honest with myself, and to be frank, I didn't much care for the genre either. I hadn't even read cover to cover the whole of Infinite Jest. I'd come to accept the fact that I'd never write the next unbearable lightness of being, that I'd never come close to it. Why, you might ask? Well, to put it simply, I was an asshole. An asshole with no real education or life experience outside of my liberal arts degree who preferred getting high to anything resembling true study and learning. At the time, there was at least one thing I knew to be true, and that was that without making the effort to find my actual classification as an artist, I'd never progress past this writer's block. I needed to be inspired, and after binge-watching a series of nostalgic horror movies from my youth, I'd become convinced that horror, and maybe even extreme horror, was my new area of exploration and exploitation as an artist. If I couldn't be the next master of literary fiction, I might at least write the next sensational Jekyll and Hyde. But in this regard, I lacked inspiration. I couldn't just go for being the next Stephen King, who in turn himself was simply a modern and bastardized form of Lovecraft, and Lovecraft, who in turn didn't build much past the threshold of Poe's Tower. Of course, this oversimplification is ignorant and unschooled. There were all sorts of minor figures, whom I call minor despite the fact that they were Goliath in comparison to me, in between. But I can only think in such grand sweeping terms, much to my detriment, as one who could presently be considered only a paralyzed failure, a skid mark on the underwear of history, something to be forgotten if lucky, but much more likely than that, to be disdained by posterity. You would think I would have settled for something like a short story to break into this new genre, to attempt to garner some interest and an audience before foraying into a full-blown novel. But no, I couldn't waste my time on such penny and dime stuff. I needed a fortune all at once, and therefore I refused to even press a key on the keyboard if it wasn't another character among the hundreds of thousands that would be required to formulate the next great revolution in horror novels. A paradigm-shifting effort would be required to make any kind of splash on the scene. I envisioned a near future where my old writer friends, those elites who had abandoned me in my hour of need, would again invite me to their parties, even beg me to make an appearance, whereupon I would laugh into the phone at the top of my lungs, and at length until they got the picture and hung up on me. Then they would finally understand what was happening. I wasn't the charity case that they needed to avoid at all costs and make false promises of introducing to their agents. No, it was the reverse case. It was they who couldn't extricate themselves from the gutter. It was they who needed to bow down and worship me as a god. Anyways, there I was, sweating my balls off in my underwear in a tiny apartment with nothing but a floor fan, sitting in front of an empty white page on the screen. As I was busy greedily plucking at a blemish on my chin, making it larger and larger, it came to me. I'd heard the stories of the red rooms on the dark web, places where terror and torture knew no bounds. I thought that it might just be a lead, a single thread, something which could be spun and woven into a dark tale of evil, madness, and bloodlust. My only experience with the Onion Network was buying weed off of the Silk Road when the dread Pirate Roberts ruled that dark ocean. I opened up Chrome on my laptop and searched up the Tor browser. After downloading and connecting, I stared at the main page, not knowing how to go any further down this rabbit hole. So I did the only thing I knew how. I connected to Reddit and began searching the forums for what destinations, what inspirations I was seeking. Might I add that I really can't stand Reddit. The moderators, such tight-ass, stuck-up sons of bitches. But where else to look? Quora? Who the hell even knows what that is? Who were these nameless millions on the internet? The most vile fiends in the comments sections. The most insidious, compulsive autodidacts that searched desperately and endlessly for someone else who'd been wrong about something, just so they could point it out with a superior rhetoric, as if doing so was the equivalent to defending a dissertation. What kind of lives were these nameless, these anonymous creatures living cooped up in a basement somewhere? I should talk, right? I was one anonymous post away from being identical to them. All this mess made me long for a return to the Dark Ages, a period of time where people weren't narcissistic enough to write anything down about themselves. Probably not egotistical enough to think that posterity would have any interest in them, or that their meandering day-to-day thoughts would provide any benefit. Now, in the tech age that we lived in, where every fart must be documented and posted online, I could only pray for Armageddon to come soon. What do you want from me? I told you I wasn't one of the good guys, and if I haven't done enough to convince you so far, just stay tuned. Despite this, I eventually found a list of links that could be tried, with no promises and no guarantees, posted by another of these anonymous users. I began ferreting around through these links, one by one, finding a variety of highly interesting, yet otherwise unimportant, plain HTML sites. That is, interesting from the point of view of the question as to who would have spent any of their time on such a horseshit hoax with no obvious monetization potential. These red rooms, which were not live but only recorded, had only descriptions of what was about to happen, followed by video links at the bottom which could be downloaded. Clearly, no one in their right mind would have downloaded such a link and given its executable any kind of super user privileges. The low-quality plain HTML site didn't bespoke an operation with any kind of capital or even a rogue professional developer behind it, which was what I was searching for. I wanted to find at least the portal to the kind of thing that was only shared among the most exclusive forums, where those with enough disposable income were able to watch a murder in live action. Whatever I saw there, be it a hoax or real, for I wasn't sure whether I'd be able to tell or not, but was hoping that it was at least convincing enough to raise the question of authenticity, would be able to serve as inspiration for the type of look and feel of one of these things, as well as rituals, the tone, the culture, etc. It was this kind of what I called filler material which was really most essential to the plot to get the vast majority of readers hooked. The quality of the character study, the plot, etc., were very important for the agents and publishers to understand. But when you gave the common man something recognizable, something that made him envision what he sees around him in his own reality with a high degree of fidelity, well, it was something which could resuscitate and rehydrate even the most desiccated corpse of an imagination, and, let's face it, such would be required in the vast majority of cases. And so expansive details that added to the realism of the scene I had identified as a niche for myself in my former novels, which all had very grassroots and cult followings after being panned by the critics. It was this very key piece of knowledge of the art which drove me to dive deeper and deeper into these links, not being satisfied. I finally found a direction when I emerged on what was described as a mere landing page which used some rudimentary JavaScript and CSS. Here you were supposed to enter your name, email address, contact number, and if you qualified, you would be contacted for the opportunity in question, though what exactly that entailed was entirely vague. There was merely a banner stating, "If you are here and you know why you are here, register below. Qualified candidates will be contacted within 2 business days." The only inkling I had of what this was came from the original Reddit post by that anonymous user, who had briefly given a summary of each URL posted. This one had been described as not really a red room, but in my opinion, something much more extreme. An enticing bit of clickbait that had gotten me to bite hook, line, and sinker. Such a greedy, hungry boy was I. Just as I'd finished creating a new Gmail account with fake credentials and added those credentials into the form pressing submit, I heard a voice behind me that made me nearly jump out of my skin. "What you doing there? You're like so absorbed right now." It was Nessie. Good old messy Nessie. I turned around in my swivel chair to greet her. There I saw her standing right behind me. God, how did I not hear her come in? What a creepo. She stood in front of me with her frizzled, wavy hair sticking out at all angles. In face, she was not the most attractive, just passable. Her frame was identical with that of a 12-year-old boy. She was skinny as a waif and looked as if a strong wind might send her 5-foot frame tumbling like a weed in an old western. Her habit of dressing was either punk or gothic. I couldn't tell which and frankly cared little, for it changed often. Messy Nessie was a nice person, especially when you'd been feeling lonely and needed to get out of your own head. But spend too long with her in any state of sobriety and she became intolerably annoying. So why the nickname, you might ask? Well, physically and mentally she resembled one of those hoarder houses you watch on A&E. She didn't tend to keep up with hygiene much, and her ratty clothes, which might have been considered stylish to whatever of the constantly changing subcultures she belonged to this week, were to my trained eye nothing more than a homeless person's rags. The subculture was just an excuse for not putting any effort into one's appearance. But I could live with that, at least temporarily. What really irked me was the constant gullibility, whereby she would believe anything she read on the internet and become a devotee to any conspiracy or strange belief system, at least for the space of a week. Her beliefs were constantly changing and always influenced by these often anonymous posters who spoke of aliens, lizard folks ruling the country, the flat earth hypothesis, astrology, you name it. And it's not even that I find these viewpoints intolerable, but to combine all of these beliefs into one person simultaneously was enough to make anyone nauseous. But I digress. Hey there, Nessie. I see you're comfortable just letting yourself in, huh? At first I read a micro-expression of pain, which quickly morphed into one of a school teacher, who must explain something commonplace to a school child. Well, of course. I was worried about you. And I believe in communal living, of course. Anyone should be able to come into your house when they feel they should do so. And like I said, I was worried. You know, violent crime is on the rise in Buffalo. Why do you think that is? I interrupted with a superior smirk. Well, I mean, I'm not sure if it's the Freemasons or the Illuminati this time. There have been some UFO sightings recently in the area. Maybe we'll never know, but I have my opinion. So? I queried. She leaned in and whispered, "The mayor. He's compromised. He's one of those." She raised her hands, with fingers curled, gesturing, as if it were a claw. "Infiltrated by the lizard folks, did you say now?" "Shh!" she hushed me. "The walls have ears. They have scanners everywhere." I nearly lost my composure over the sudden and random Philip K. Dick reference. "Okay, Nessie, I'll abide. Let's change the subject. Thanks for inviting yourself in. What do we have on the agenda for tonight?" She looked at me with eyes wide, as if she'd just remembered something important which needed to be done immediately. "I've got to check our horoscopes." As she lifted her phone and began gazing at the screen as if in a trance, I got a look at my monitor through my peripheral vision, realizing that the form I had filled out was still up on the screen. I quickly reached over and closed the tab and then X'd out of the Tor browser. "Are you writing again? You didn't tell me you were working on anything." She was suddenly watching me again. I stretched my arms upward and let out a long sigh. "Well, not really. I mean, I'm trying. I think I've been inspired." "By me? I must be your muse," she spoke excitedly. I smiled in turn as one might smile at a young child. "Yeah, baby, it's all you. You've awakened something deep inside my soul." I bet you'll put me in the novel. I always wondered what that would be like," she said, jumping into my lap and throwing her arms around my neck as she nuzzled her mug under my jaw. "Once your book hits the shelves, we could be one of those artsy punk rock couples. Kinda like Sid and Nancy?" I looked at her with my eyes narrowed. "You know, Sid killed Nancy in the end, right?" I said incredulously. "Oh," she looked at me somehow crestfallen at the revelation. "But hey, regarding the book, you never know." I let it drop cold there. "How'd my horoscope look anyways?" "Well," she said, putting on that mischievous grin that actually made me feel something approaching a genuine affection at times. "It was more of a forecast than anything. It's looking like snow." Her eyes lit up as she held up 2 little white baggies full of powder. And that brings me to the next reason I kept Messy Nessie around. She was a local dealer and she was always riding dirty. I looked across at her with a genuine smile now pasted on my lips. "How about that? Maybe you are my muse after all." That's when everything became a blur. I remember watching her pouring the fine substance onto my coffee table, chopping it up with a credit card, plowing the divided substance into individual cornrows, and handing me a cut-off piece of straw with which to vacuum the snow up with my nose. After my first line, I recalled reaching under the desk and coming up with a couple of shot glasses and a liter of potato vodka. A few ounces of vodka and a few lines later, and we were off to the races. I dimly recalled scheduling an Uber and heading down to Chippewa. We were meeting some of Nessie's drugged-out friends there. I recall Nessie grinding on my thigh like hell while I stood disinterestedly, staring at a fine group of party sluts, while I sipped a gin and tonic. Before I knew it, there was another whirlwind rush of air, and we were over at the Pink, doing more lines of coke on a trough urinal. Nessie standing by my side in the men's room, among numerous other strangers I didn't recognize, who were indulging in our party supplies. I recall sucking down a sandwich off the grill as I watched Nessie dribble roast beef au jus on her chin, while the stains spread across the collar of her shirt. Before you knew it, we were next door at the Brick Bar, shooting a game of billiards while intermittently stepping out to the alley to snort additional lines of snow among a varied cast of strange characters. Really something more like parasitic leeches that we had picked up along the way. After that, everything goes dark. I awoke to an alarm ringing like mad. My mind was completely obliterated. I could hardly understand who I was or whether I was living or dead. As I gradually came to, I was able to roll over and pry my eyelids open. I was staring straight at the alarm clock, which read 1 p.m. I'd slept through the entire morning. As I began my descent back down into the world of the living, I began to realize that I was not in my own apartment, but in one much nicer. I was in Nessie's bedroom, of course. My apartment was located in Amherst, probably one of the cheapest in the city, whereas the duplex she rented one half of was located in downtown Hamburg. Her parents were rich and still funded her lifestyle, an apparent fact which had led to a lack of ambition in life, but a popularity among the locals which could not be easily imitated. Everyone was perpetually knocking at her door, trying to buy drugs or borrow them, and she always made it work, with even the worst sort of parasite. Her parents, who lived in what could be described as a mansion in Orchard Park, still paid her rent, gave her a healthy allowance, and in all respects funded her lifestyle. This fact had made her a key acquisition to my long line of female companions in this particular time of need. She was always buying me little expensive gifts out of the blue that I could pawn for rent money or trade for drugs if need be. It was working out so far spectacularly, and I felt I might actually love her, for it was the caring and the taking care of that I felt truly inspired love. Who am I kidding talking like that? Like I've got some Cyrano de Bergerac in the bushes behind me. Now let me tell the truth. I'd never been in love, and likely I never will be. All human interactions, whether born of hate or love, are simply processes emanating from human selfishness and the natural will to dominate others. Of this, I hope to convince you summarily. As I rolled over, I came face to face with Nessie, whose wide-open horse lips were causing a raucous of wind that sounded like ocean waves advancing and receding on the shore. I noted the dried crust of blood protruding from each nostril, and in that moment realized my own discomfiture as I began to pick the coagulated mix of white powder and blood matrix from my own nose with a painful grimace, as the little hairs were occasionally pulled out in tandem with the blobs of human crust. I sat up with a disgusting taste growing in my mouth, which was also feeling as dry as the desert, and I mean as if my teeth had become pieces of ivory that might fall out at any moment and make perfect keys on a mouse's piano. I moaned acutely as I slowly mounted the effort to roll out of bed. At this late stage in the day, I didn't bother to wake Nessie as I pulled my underwear and pants on, followed by my booze-stained t-shirt. I slapped the alarm before making sure that she was still breathing, before heading out the door in a hurry. Of course she'd understand. Down in the kitchen, which was immaculate and modern relative to that in my dingy little apartment that stunk of someone else's garbage, I drank deeply of the sink water before opening the fridge. I found the typical fare in her highly stocked fridge. I made myself a prosciutto and provolone sandwich on a slice of fresh Italian baguette. She did all her shopping at Wegmans and bought mostly organic and highly artisan fare, while I did most of my shopping at Walmart in Amherst, where I bought whatever was cheapest and close to the expiration date. Before I left, I scheduled an Uber and grabbed an energy drink from her fridge. Out on the steps, my heart sank as the door to the other side of the duplex opened almost as soon as I landed on the steps and lighted my cigarette. "Is that yours?" I heard a hostile, accusatory tone. The old man that lived next door to Nessie must have been almost 75 or so, if not older, I had estimated. The two sides of the duplex shared a pair of concrete steps and a small porch as a landing. The guy had given me trouble from day one, the old perv clearly having kept track of Nessie's comings and goings for some time, with special attention paid to her male suitors. I turned around slowly as I puffed on my cig and made sure to exhale it towards the opening in his door. "Filthy habit," he muttered in a disgusted manner. I uttered in an aloof manner. "I said, is that yours?" he said, pointing in the direction of my shoes, but directly in front of his door. As my eyes followed his gesture, I witnessed the spectacle of a used contraceptive full of biological substance, laying fully stretched out in front of his door. My eyes went from the dirty contraceptive back up to the expectant look of detestation on his face, back down to the latex contraceptive, and then back up to his face. I smiled and inhaled another puff before I answered. "Nah," I moaned as I simultaneously began exhaling again, a full cloud of smoke into his face. The old man fell into a coughing fit as the cloud of smoke screened his face for a moment as it billowed into his apartment. "You bastard," he shouted at me. "That's a filthy habit." As he mouthed his maledictions towards me, I vaguely recalled taking Nessie from behind on the staircase in full view of anyone who happened to be abroad on the streets at 4 a.m. on a Saturday, or what's more, who happened to have a Ring camera facing in this direction. "Pick it up, you disease-infested maggot," he cursed. Rather than honor his command, I flicked my cigarette butt in his direction as I simultaneously bounded down the stairs towards my Uber, which had just pulled up on the curb. Damn you to hell," he shouted after being struck in the nose with the burning filter. I raised my middle finger without turning around as I pulled the door open and hopped in. "I'm sorry, did I tell you I used to be one of the good guys before such and such an incident led me down the highway to hell? Maybe I was exaggerating, but I urge you to look deep into your own soul and draw your own conclusions. The inability to think independently is probably man's greatest fatal flaw, more so than the bane of so-called hubris. It's just difficult to say whether it is the sheep following their masters or the wolves circling at the margins who will be the straw that breaks the back of society and leads us all into a pit of hell and damnation." As I rode home in that Uber, reeking of booze and stale cigarette smoke, I didn't dwell on the lost portions of the previous night during which I had been blacked out. This was a common occurrence in the dark world we inhabited. It was part of the price one had to pay to feel even partially alive once in a while. Nessie understood this just as well, if not more so than I. And I knew she wouldn't begrudge me my sudden and ungentlemanly exit. She knew I wasn't one for lounging around and cuddling over a bowl of popcorn in a Netflix rom-com the next day after copulation. This was just the nature of the beast, and as such was something she took for granted about me, on some level understanding my true nature, and forgiving it. When I arrived home, I stumbled up the stairs and went into my apartment. As soon as I was inside, I inadvertently collapsed on the couch and must have been out for at least a few hours before I came to, ready to rouse, ready to live, to breathe again, to enter this strange realm of the living, the sober. Without fully understanding why, the urge to begin plucking at the keyboard, to begin mining for that rare and precious gem of a new direction, again burned within me. I raised myself from my bootstraps like Lazarus and clawed my way to the desk where my laptop sat open and idle, a screensaver bouncing across the screen. As I hit a random key and typed in my password, I was astounded at what I saw on the screen. There was a Tor browser instance opened with a mysterious URL typed into the browser. Next to it, my Chrome was also opened, though I was one who habitually closed tabs and kept a tidy desktop, and I could not remember having left these here. On the Tor instance, the URL had been typed in but not yet executed. I clicked on Chrome and saw my fake Gmail account pop up. There was a recent message in the inbox, but it was not bold, rather was normal typeface as if it had already been clicked on. My mouse pointer hovered over the email as I read the title and beginning snippet in awe. The subject line read, "Dear Mr., you have been chosen." However, after the Dear Mr. portion, it had stated my real last name, rather than the fake name used to create the Gmail account and submit the form. My mind wrestled with itself, trying to recall whether in my rushed state of agitation, I had accidentally submitted my real name on the form rather than the invented alias. I recalled Nessie having startled me just at the time, but I was iffy on whether I submitted the form before she had interrupted me or after. I had indeed become one of those unreliable narrators, a trope I so detested. I noticed the same URL from the Tor browser was contained within the email. I could only surmise that Nessie and I, or perhaps me alone, had returned to my apartment at some point during the night. I opened my bank account and saw no evidence that I had withdrawn cash or taken an Uber back home and then back downtown at any point during the night. Either way that this happened, what a massive mistake. What a massive misjudgment. I was now questioning whether the project was any longer feasible given the fact that I'd straight up doxed myself to the secret organization in question. And by the way, what was the criteria by which I had been selected? Of course, they might have been able to find the Kindle or perhaps a used paperback of one of my previous novels, for they were now out of print, on Amazon, but really, why would they care? I was a hack, a nobody, a once-upon-a-time story that had turned into a cautionary tale of maladaptation and failure to launch. Who was I to them, and who were they to me? In any case, I couldn't help myself from the temptation of finding out who had thus labeled me a chosen one. I pulled up the Tor instance and my mouse hovered over the URL in a trembling fashion before clicking enter. I nearly closed my eyes as the page began to load in the typically glacial fashion of the Onion network. What I observed next on the screen was another landing page with a bit more explanatory fare. From what I could gather, by way of explanation, the page I had landed on was the gateway into an exclusive podcast with a rotating cast of hosts. The theme of the podcast was the most extreme horror stories imaginable, a competition of sorts between the hosts. The one caveat was that the tale had to be true and, of course, not yet reported by the mass media. In other words, the orators or researchers, what have you, had to be ahead of the curve. I imagined a cavalcade of former detectives, forensic experts, and sleuth hacktivists must be behind this endeavor. It wasn't quite the Red Room I had sought after, but Lord, what material one might find in this for a new extreme horror thriller
that could make the rest of the upstarts look like snoring sleepers. While I was impressed with the idea, I rolled my eyes as I saw scrawled at the bottom the enter button with the simple warning above, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here." I thought for a moment about whether I might have something better to do that day. My head had stopped its infernal aching, my body had been hydrated, my mouth repleted with spittle. I could, for instance, give Nessie a call and see how she was, make sure that she could get out of bed all right, was recuperating, and what was doing for that day. But alas, the empty word processor on the screen, the image of my bank account, which every month appeared to have one less decimal, was beginning to be maddening. It seemed at this point I had two choices. On the one hand, I could buckle down, source this material from this dark realm of madness and intrigue, and finally begin writing, rejuvenate my broken career, likely attain growing accolades, and have a rising star to fame and fortune. On the other, I could call up Nessie and spend the day with her, and many days following, until I was desperate enough to ask her hand in marriage, to move in with her, to be her kept man, and allow her to take care of me for the rest of my coke and liquor-fueled days. I strapped myself into the swivel chair and clicked enter. The next page took what seemed ages to load as I sat with utmost anticipation. As the page finally rendered, I saw a simple black screen with a cursive phrase rendered above a small Java applet-type window, which was also dark but featured a timer that was currently counting down. Above the window was the title of the video, The 4 Podcast, Episode 663. On the right-hand side was a head count with a scroll bar showing who was currently in the waiting room alongside me. I scrolled through dozens of nondescript names, mostly male-sounding, but some female as well that meant nothing to me. There were currently 100 others, sitting in the dark, bobbing their virtual heads in anticipation. As the timer scrolled down to 30 seconds, 20 seconds, 10 seconds, and then 1 second, there appeared promptly at the head of the list 4 more names. These names were written as follows: Berith, Asmodeus, Sonelin, and Belial, who I assumed must be the hosts of the podcast. As the timer vanished, the name Belial appeared on the screen, who I took to be the host of this particular episode, which it appeared was a live stream rather than a pre-recording. Belial's voice came into being as if out of the dark ether, low, velvety, maybe even scholarly in its tone. He started by greeting the audience and welcoming them back for episode 663. He was glad to see that interest in their little podcast had been growing and that there were some new faces in the crowd. As he said this, what suddenly flashed onto the screen were numerous tiny squares with faces in them, some smiling, some looking to be in shock at what they saw, while some of the squares were just a blur with some low illumination coming through what appeared to be a webcam shutter. I realized the light next to my webcam had indeed come on, and I saw my own face in one of those tiny squares near the bottom. "Damn it, these guys are pros," I whispered to myself as I quickly closed the webcam, having carelessly left the shutter open. Without further ado, all of the tiny faces vanished and the screen was again dark, with only the name of the presenter scrawled across in a neat cursive font. I pondered for a moment whether I had accidentally downloaded some form of malware by clicking into the site, or whether they had somehow managed to trace everyone's IP address simultaneously. But either way I looked at it, it didn't seem logical or possible, no matter what angle I observed the phenomenon from. This is when he began his story, with no further introductions as to who he was or what it was he was about to do. The title of the story he gave out as merely Blood Sex. The story began with a meth head in his hotel room whose name was not given. The unnamed individual, an underemployed plumber covered in tattoos, was in the process of donning a pair of leather gloves and pulling a hoodie on. As he continued to take hits off of his pipe, he seemed to be growing further agitated. He hadn't slept in days, it was clear. As he looked into the mirror, a hideously deformed face stared back at him. Not only that, but the reflection in the mirror did not follow his movements, but did the exact opposite. If he raised his left hand, so did it, rather than its right hand. In other words, the reflection, rather than existing in the mirror realm at an equal distance from himself, from the glass, in actuality it must have been somehow in the room with him. It began whispering to him, dark and unknown phrases in a language most incomprehensible to myself, though Belial seemed fluent in this language as he spoke those words and phrases in rapidity. I felt as if the words had a strange, entrancing effect on myself as well. As I continued to listen, I poured myself a shot of vodka and downed it in an attempt to snap out of it, to wake up, so to speak. Some hair off the dog to shake off what remained of my hangover. I then heard how the whispering voice was driving the man to take more hits off of his pipe, possibly in an effort to ward it off before he finally succumbed to its enticing entreaties. With that, the man was out the door into the dark of the night. Once on the street, the people he passed had faces that warped and changed under the imagined pressure of his glance. The bodies of women which this meth head sex addict had typically salivated over in the street now appeared to warp and bulge in a grotesque manner that led him to veer away in revulsion as he continued stumbling forward. When he had finally reached his destination, a suburban household with no lights on, he carefully crept up the sidewalk and past the front door, careening into an alleyway beside the house. He was able to slide a window on the ground floor open and pull himself inside with little effort. It was clear that there was only one place to go, and that was up the stairs. But first, he made a pit stop in the kitchen. There, as he gazed his dark reflection in the cabinets, he saw himself clearly for the first time. His mouth was a gaping yaw, completely toothless. Deep wrinkles were forming intersecting canals across his entire face, which looked like that of an ancient mummy loosed from its sarcophagus. He shuddered in horror as he shrunk from the image looking back at him, knowing what it was the voice had told him could correct this problem. He grabbed a long, sharp butcher's knife and made his way up the stairs. At this point in the story, my mind drifted slightly. I noticed that the number of listeners had gone down drastically since the beginning of the episode. There were now only 20 or so members left listening, including in this headcount the orators themselves. Damn, I thought. There's no accounting for taste. The story is pretty engrossing thus far. The man had made his way to the second story of the house. He stood in a short, dark hallway which opened up onto a bathroom and another room whose door was closed. The floor was carpeted, and he was able to creep softly down the hallway, quiet as a mouse. As he opened the door carefully, ever so cautiously, he could see through the opening that it was a bedroom, and that some occupant lay sleeping in the bed by the window. Under the moonlight, which shone in, making the sleeper awash with plutonian splendor. The man in the hoodie watched silently as he set the knife down on the bed near the sleeper's feet and took one last hit off of his meth pipe. exhaling the smoke into the beams of that alien light through the window. Before he knew it, the sleeper was sitting straight up in the bed, staring at him. He grabbed the knife and lunged forward. As he drew his arm up into the air, he observed that it was an old man between 70 and 80 years old, though it was difficult to pinpoint in the dark. The old man let out a blood-curdling scream as the knife came down into his chest again and again. But it didn't end there. After the victim had stopped struggling and become deathly still, the knife continued to find its way through the skin and to open up new vistas within. The killer continued to smoke his pipe as he worked, dragging out organ and entrails, and what he did next, I won't repeat here again, for it had already spun through my mind far too many times. In brief, as the title of the story had foretold, the man began to pleasure himself with the organs, the entrails, and the blood. This abominable act of eroticism in turn led to a most strange pregnancy. Within minutes, the man's belly had swollen to 3 times its usual size and then continued growing. The man continued to scream in horror and agony as the tattooed skin and muscle stretched to its limits and began to tear open. What gradually began to take shape in the shadows of this gore-filled bedroom was a creature with iridescent, slimy and gelatinous gleaming skin with no type of keratinous or scale-like layers to protect it. Looking much like an oversized embryo of some kind of undiscovered deep-sea creature. The killer lay twitching and moaning as this thing out of the ooze crawled upon him and began devouring him limb from limb. As it ate, it appeared to gain strength and muscle mass, scales and a protective exoskeleton, and so forth, and eventually, as it stood with its horned, bulking mass, one of the kings of hell stood over its meal, born anew into the world of man. I had completely lost track of time as I heard that familiar voice behind me again. My eye just barely noticed that only 5 remained listening in, meaning I was the sole guest at this point. I quickly X'd out of the browser as I turned to find Nessie staring at me with quizzical eyes. God, are you watching porn or something? No. God, can't you learn to knock? I did knock. No one answered and you left the door unlocked again. That sounded like some kinky shit. I didn't know you were into that stuff. I told you it wasn't that, I muttered in a clearly aggressive tone. Gee, sorry. You're so touchy sometimes. Anyways, I'm headed over to meet up with Sam and DeLuca. You wanna come? Oh, I let out a long sigh. In my weakened state and with what I had just strained my constitution to listen to, I was in a state of complete befuddlement and fog. I think last night took all the juice I had left in the batteries, babe. Gotta recharge them before I go out a bit again. Oh, you introverts are so boring sometimes. What are you gonna do? Sit here all night and play with yourself? When you could be getting a piece of this? She said, lifting up her shirt to expose her all too skeletal-seeming hip bones and ribcage. No, nothing like that. I thought I might do some writing. I'm feeling inspired now that my muse has stopped in again. Remember, these novels don't write themselves, baby. I've got to do some kind of work occasionally. I get it. The artist needs his alone time. Alright, call me if you change your mind. I'm out of here. She ran up and gave me a peck on the cheek before turning and leaving the room. Once she was gone, I collapsed back into my chair, my head spinning. The pattern of what was told didn't fit what I'd expected. Something of a true crime narrative, but something little or maybe not even known. Instead, what I had listened to was something more akin to extreme, fantastical horror fiction, maybe some kind of mixture between the Dahmer Confession or Richard Ramirez, mixed with Hellraiser, crossed with some kind of Freddy Krueger shit, all warped into a cautionary tale about addiction. Nice fusion, by the by, I remember thinking as I let any further notion of the metaphysics of this situation drift into the background of my mind. Much more than what it was I had experienced on my first foray into the underground of the internet was what was I going to do about it. I was expecting to write a novel, but that would take time. The novel was more in the realm of the eventual. Without much more debate spent on the matter, I pulled up the word processor and began writing down what I had heard, almost word for word, from Belial. It was almost midnight by the time I'd finished editing. What I had achieved was a work of downright plagiarism for sure. But the question that perpetually echoed in my mind was, who would know? By the end of the tale, I'd been the only member of the audience. Seemingly, only the writer himself would know, and given his platform and mode of delivering his art, I don't think it likely that they would have much power to do anything about it. The secrecy of their theme, the unknown, true crime stuff, I could understand being delivered in such a forum as the dark web, where those who shared such knowledge that perhaps even legally was a gray area would be beyond prosecution. However, to my mind, to ply your fiction in such a manner just precluded you from your copyright privileges. Therefore, I had every right to do it. I submitted the story to one of the online horror journals within the next half hour, and after that I was beat. I passed out on the couch, full of the anticipation that the story would be accepted, and that a small but much needed check would be my reward. More importantly, this would be my comeback publication, the first thing I'd published in 2 years. I slowly drifted away under the intoxicating fumes of these reveries of what was to come. A week later, I woke up to an email notification detailing an offer for publication of my story. I hadn't read the fine print, and it turned out the payout was only around $50. But hell, I decided to take it. The next story I submitted, I'd make sure had a real payout, something north of $500. Things were moving in the right direction. That's what mattered. The decision to publish had been made at light speed relative to my previous novel submissions to agents and publishers. I could already feel the old addiction itching at me again, a warm sensation that moved from my groin up towards my skull. I felt the need to share this news with someone and began racking my brains. It took me a while, perhaps too long, to come up with the idea of calling Messy Nessie. We hadn't spoke since I last blew her off a week ago. I'd been avoiding her. The prospect of the story, my last foothold on this so-called career of mine, being rejected had been too much for me to handle. Her repetitive and mind-numbing conspiracies and avant-garde spiritualism. Now, though, was a time for companionship and a time for celebration. I picked up my cell phone and gave her a call. She was over at my place within half an hour. We started out light, toasting with some champagne she'd brought over. "To the Renaissance man," she said with a smile which was not at all ironic, thirsty even for my touch. She was actually proud of this minuscule accomplishment of mine. By her failure of a writer boyfriend, imagine that. At times, this girl could be a marvel. I imagined some of those elites I had dated in the past during my run of success at the top of this writing game, hearing that I'd become a small-time pulp horror writer selling stories for $50 a pop, much less plagiarized grift. I could imagine their looks of disdain and superiority, maybe even disgust, as if they were looking at an actual cockroach that had been crushed under their heel. Next to that, Nessie was a real keeper. Maybe that whole thing about proposing one day I'd conjured up in my head wasn't so far out after all. Maybe one day, but not today. I snorted my first line of coke before pouring us a couple of shots of vodka. I shit you not, as she leaned over the snow and the shot glasses on the table and gave me a real, genuine kiss on the lips. A passionate kiss like you see in the movies when the hero rescues the damsel in distress just in time. That was the last thing I remembered. I woke up on my couch feeling as if I'd just been in a train wreck. I rolled off the couch, reeling with vertigo and searching like a man in the desert for a glass of water. It wasn't long before I realized I'd pissed myself and the couch in my comatose slumber. At the sink, I put my face under the faucet and drank massive gulps of tap water before lurching to the side and vomiting it all back up into the basin. This wasn't good. I'll spare you any more gory details. In brief, I eventually made it up to the shower after a long time, got dressed, and after even more struggles was able to eat something and finally keep it down. It was almost 7 p.m. by the time I'd reached this state of rejuvenation where I lay on the dry part of the couch, curled up watching television with a cranberry juice on my coffee table. Just as I was on the point of dozing off as one of the old Halloween movies flashed across the screen, I heard hurried footsteps approaching. The silhouette of what might have otherwise been taken as a lunatic escaped from an asylum stood in the doorway. It was Nessie. Messy Nessie. She looked more messy than usual. As she stepped out of the shadows, I could see that her mascara had melted as if she'd been crying, and her face was blotched with dry tears. Nessie, what on earth are you doing? She took a step towards me, looking quite unhinged. What on earth? She asked me. What on earth? She repeated with trembling lips. I don't understand. What's the problem? Why don't you come sit down? I tried to reason with her in a calm but caring voice, only at the last second remembering the piss-stained cushion beside me. As she crossed the room in a near cathartic sprint, I stood to embrace her. She squeezed me with strength uncommon for her small frame, nearly knocking the wind out of me. As I managed to wrench her arms off of me and set her down on the dry cushion with my blanket, she began to bawl hysterically. Oh, there, I said as I rushed around looking for a vodka bottle. I poured her a shot and one for myself, then carried it over. As I offered her the shot glass, her tearing eyes looked up momentarily. Her hand reached out with a quivering gesture as she took the glass and quickly placed it on her bottom lip, allowing it to pour in a most elegant, ladylike fashion. I forgot to mention that for someone nicknamed Messy Nessie, her table manners were flawless, and this was a constant reminder that at the end of the day, she unmistakably came from good breeding. As I rubbed her shoulders and whispered some soothing entreaties into her ear, she gradually calmed down and was able to speak again. I'm here, Nessie. I'm here. Please, tell me, what's the matter? She looked up at me now with a very serious look as if she'd seen a ghost. It must be the aliens. I almost lost my cool now. The aliens? I asked, trying to keep my tone as flat and as understanding as possible, anything to avoid another descent into hysterics. What happened? What do you mean, aliens? Spit it out, Nessie, or I can't help you. You remember my neighbor, the old guy? I nodded my head slowly up and down. Well, he's dead. I came out this afternoon and there were police everywhere with yellow tape across the door. It was murder. Oh, God, I muttered, feeling my heart slowly sinking into my stomach as I likewise sunk down onto the floor, my mouth agape. Who would? But why? How? I muttered like a man slowly going into a trance of extreme psychological puzzlement. The aliens, she whispered in a defeated, barely audible tone. But why do you say that? I now turned, not quite able to suppress my growing anger with her. Well, she cut me off sharply. It was another neighbor of ours that found the body. They knew each other and he'd gone over for a wellness check. The police told him not to say anything, but I talked with him just an hour ago after they released him from the station. He told me, oh, I can't even, she broke down again, crying and coughing miserably, tears and snot streaming out everywhere. Out with it. Out with it now, Nessie. Though I must say regretfully, I grabbed her shoulders now in a menacing way, shaking her from side to side. They dissected him, disemboweled him, butchered him, played with his guts. Oh. After that, she was lost to the world. I stood staring at her stark and still with shock. My mind clouded in paralysis, as if the inner workings had been dredged with thick molasses. A sickening nausea overwhelmed me as the contents of my story returned to my mind's eye in a flash. Simultaneously, the half-digested contents of my dinner was felt in the back of my throat. I ran into the kitchen and vomited into the sink. I watched the vomit swirling down the drain as I faded into unconsciousness. I spent the next few days shut in, afraid to leave the house. The grotesque vision of the story, combined with the contraceptive left on the neighbor's stoop, had combined into a metaphorical guillotine dangling over my neck. I had immediately sent a follow-up email rescinding my agreement for publication to the magazine due to my own personal reasons. But the magazine or e-zine or whatever hadn't responded. I knew that it was already too late. Logically speaking, I knew that I was okay for the time being at least. There wouldn't be an immediate sequence of events whereby someone familiar with the grisly details of the case might happen upon this little-known horror magazine and happen to light upon my story in particular, then put all the pieces of the puzzle together. The fact that I was dating the neighbor of the victim, that we'd had confrontations in the past, etc., into a resounding and inextricable case against me. I thought about ringing up a lawyer and asking what one should do when a story they have published comes to resemble a crime that is committed. However, even the possible risks associated with talking to anyone about this was too much for me to bear. I was on the actual verge of psychological collapse. The tension was mounting and all my nervous resources were depleted. I remember nothing from the night of the murder. It was a complete blackout. Nessie had texted me that she was being called down to the station for questioning. I knew that she'd tell them who she was out with that night, and my name would come up. I'd already, in a very nonchalant manner, asked her what she remembered from that night, and her account was very similar to mine. That is, almost nothing. However, there were undoubtedly others who would know where we went, what we did, and when we parted with company. Eventually, I'd find myself being called down for questioning in turn. And this was the heart of the matter. Would I break? Would I confess and divulge what I'd done? The story I had stolen, its content and similarities to the murder? my previous encounter with the victim. Without understanding why, I felt myself drawn back to that portal on the dark web. I needed answers more so than anything else to understand this phenomenon. To understand would be to save my sanity, even if I lost my freedom in the process. The idea that the murderer must be one of those left listening at the end of the last podcast, that is, one of the 4 hosts, was clear in my mind, but how could I prove it? I made my way over to the writing desk, even with the anvil of dread that was shackled to my ankle. I turned my laptop on and opened up a Tor instance. As I logged into the portal of the 4 podcast, it just so happened that another story was to begin shortly. As I watched the head count growing in the lobby as the timer counted down, my nerves got the best of me. I reached under the desk and pulled out the bottle of vodka, pouring myself a pre-game shot, so to speak. Another 2 of these shots followed before the timer had reached its end, and 4 more joined the head count as the screen for episode 664 flashed into existence. It read, Bareth, this time. The introductory shenanigans were fewer this time as the gruff voice of the orator spoke his title, The Mechanism of Meat, and began to spin his tale. Most particularly, there was no mention of a crime resembling the story from the episode 663, despite the fact that it was by now well reported by the local and national media. The story centered upon a tech billionaire, an orthopedic surgeon / biomedical engineer who made a fortune in the medical implant space. His origins were a working class family who suffered through poverty and owned nothing, not even retirement for his parents, who worked themselves to the bone with labor. He'd struggled early in his career to make his talent recognized, and after being overlooked for growth opportunities on numerous occasions, he had gone out on his own on an entrepreneurial endeavor. After his first early success had catapulted him into the realm of the richest 1%, he had become something of a playboy at first. Not long after this, he had begun to be approached by very famous and very wealthy persons. His image changed almost overnight. He'd been given entrance into the secret brotherhood of the rich, but there would be a price to pay. He began angling to purchase both a major media corporation as well as a successful and popular social media platform. Once successful, the media empire was turned into something of a hammer to be used to control the narrative and sway the masses. In this way, he could help the richest elites and most powerful politicians maintain their power and wealth at any cost to the common man. In return, he would have unlimited access to the playgrounds of the rich and powerful, and what untold wonder and splendor they had to offer. One day, a thin man in a black suit knocked at his door. The man's thin, manicured hand held a cigarette in a bejeweled holder. By his dress and his bearing, it was clear that he was surely quite wealthy and well-connected. He invited this billionaire to come to a dinner party up north, whereby he could be introduced to this exclusive and elite group of individuals, and they could discuss plans to fly to his private island, if he were deemed worthy by the group. The things which were done on this private island were to the common grade of man unspeakable. There were no limitations on desire. The common stock was cattle, and the philosopher kings who ruled over this lot of bovine were able to satisfy their needs without the limitations of law and order. Those laws, religious or otherwise, the thin man informed him, only applied to the dogs that licked their boots nightly. The The billionaire was left with a little red card with a date, a time, and an address scrawled across it. The decision was his to make. He thought long and hard about what was to come. He already had conquered the poverty he was born into. He'd conquered the quest for political power. Now what remained was the ultimate satisfaction of his desires. With entrance to a cavalcade of the most exclusive elites on the planet, he would likely be rubbing elbows with trillionaires, presidents, and dictators of foreign lands. The temptation sunk deep into his mind until the countless fantasies consumed him and wiped away all other considerations of decency or concern for his fellow man. He was in. The dinner party was a masquerade, and the guests all wore masks which featured distorted and exaggerated animal faces. There were men wearing a lion, a gorilla, an elephant, the man who invited him wearing a deer, 4 in total. But there was also a cast of women wearing a tiger, an elk, a goat, even a long-necked woman wearing a giraffe, 4 additional guests. The billionaire was handed the dog mask. He was the 9th. As they sat down to the dinner fare, the deer face sat next to him and began regaling him with tales of past conquests at the island. As he whispered gently in the man's ear, he felt himself transported and overwhelmed by the delicacies and delights of the flesh more exotic than heretofore known to man. It was nectar of the gods. There was only one catch. The thin man told him there had been a request from the group for him to put his skills to use. The thin man escorted him into the kitchen, whereupon he discovered another man tied to a chair with a mask on, that of the hyena, the 10th party guest in total. This man tied to the chair, he was told, was another member of their group, someone high up in the political sphere. They were about to give him the greatest pleasures of his life. The man had an insatiable desire to be eaten. After a long while of his pleadings and petitions, the group was finally giving the man what he most desired. They needed someone with precise surgical skills so as to not damage the meat, and to give him the most refined psychological experience possible. The billionaire was, of course, hesitant hearing this story, but it seems something had changed with those other whispered stories in his ear. He appeared to have little ability to resist the commands given him. And so he rolled up his sleeves, and after chaining the man down on a butcher's block, he was able to get to work with his scalpel. The victim awoke screaming halfway through the procedure, pleading with him to stop. But he was reassured that the screams were only of the purest joy, and that the man had already assured them that they must ignore anything he says once the procedure had started. That is, there was no safe word, and no going back by his own specific instruction. At the end of the dissection, the billionaire prepared the finest tartare a cannibal could desire, and when told that he must take the first bite, he ate ravenously. The more he ate, paradoxically, the hungrier he became. As he devoured, his tongue began to feel strange. It was somehow getting in the way of his hunger, of his efforts at mastication. He couldn't formulate its effects in words, however. Standing also became a chore intolerable, and he slowly moved to the floor as the thin man placed his bowls of meat in front of him, and as he sucked them down faster and faster, swallowing the bits of meat whole. By the time he noticed the party group all standing around him, it became apparent that his feet and hands had shrunken to such a degree that he could no longer stand or get up off his knees and elbows. He could grab things only with his mouth, where his distended tongue hung from his jaws. His swollen belly nearly touched the floor as he crawled about madly, trying to plead with his new friends for help. However, he could no longer speak or even formulate words. The deer head approached and placed a collar and chain around his neck while simultaneously placing a bowl that reeked like human feces in front of him, a putrid slop. "No more of the good stuff for you, old boy. That's reserved only for we gods. This is good kibble for you, and you'll find it quite suited to your tastes." The story ended as the thin man walked off into the night with his new friend on its leash. By this time, I had pickled myself with vodka, unable to listen any further without, shot after shot, to take the continuous edge off of the knife that felt stuck between my ribs, sinking incrementally deeper with each word. Before I fell unconscious, I noticed that once again all the listeners had left except for me, who had sat totally entranced and unable to look away from the evil horrors that were unfolding in my mind's eye. You won't be surprised when I tell you how I awoke the next day. As I pulled myself up the couch, feeling each muscle scream with pain as if I'd just run a marathon, I stumbled over to the laptop. On the screen, I saw that the entire story, The Mechanism of Meat, had been written from start to finish exactly as I'd heard it the previous night. Furthermore, it had been submitted to the same journal with an immediate response of acceptance for publication. I had responded again in agreement. The story would be published in the next periodical coming out in a week from now. As I collapsed onto the couch, pale as a ghost, and sank into the cushion, turning the television on, a newscaster's face filled the screen in front of me. A senator who'd been visiting Buffalo had been found murdered. According to a leaked source, it was a clear case of cannibalism, and the police suspected a connection with the previous murder. A serial killer was on the loose in Buffalo. Nessie walked in as I sat glued to my laptop, searching obsessively through news articles about the recent murders. I heard her coming this time and turned around before she could say anything. This time she wasn't alone. She had a friend with her. I'd only seen once before when we were out on the town, but was never formally introduced to. "This is Sasha. Hope you don't mind. I told her you were writing again, and she has some good contacts in the industry." Of course she did. In the world Nessie was from, no matter what you did in life, there were some important and wealthy people willing to help you go further, to give you that starting point or that edge over the competition. It was the hidden network that kept the rich rich, and the likes of me always struggling to get a seat at the table. It was always astonishing to me how someone like Elizabeth Holmes could get hundreds of millions in investment without a working prototype, while millions of nameless geniuses who suffered their whole life just to give birth to their creations and bring them to the world went into their graves without their ideas ever seeing the light of day. If you had a good network, that was everything. Who was I to object to Nessie's way of caring for me? Was I going to say, no, I want to do it on my own virtues? I want to spend the rest of my life getting one rejection letter after the next from agents who won't even read the snippet? Hell no. I knew I needed every advantage I could get if I was going to reclaim my former glory in this industry. I had slowly drifted away from the conversation. As I returned, Nessie was explaining the current state of catastrophe that was my career, in her own endearing terms, of course. He hasn't published in a while, but his novels were top-notch. He's creating a new genre in the horror space now. Everyone knows that literary stuff doesn't sell anymore. He's got 2 short stories accepted for publication. One should be out any day now. Sasha glanced at me with a distinct interest in her eyes, the intentions of which I could not read. "What's the story called?" I hesitated. I had no idea of this person's character or how they'd react. "Blood sex," I muttered. I sensed that her eyes widened for at least a microsecond before the wave of whatever it was passing in her dissipated. Wow, that's, different. I could now tell that she was consciously turned on. My eyes drifted to Nessie's, who was oblivious, simply beaming with admiration for me. I returned Sasha's expression with one of my own, one that forecasted that there were possibilities between us. She seemed to reciprocate this as well. She quickly threw whatever microwave dinner was between us into the fridge. As far as titles go, it's intriguing. But what's it about? I narrowed my eyes now, sensing that I must keep an edge. Let's not spoil it. You'll have to read it when it comes out. That response, again, piqued her interest, but it seemed to only last for an instant, like a spark from a flint. It's not much to go on, but I'll get you an introduction. Of course, you'll need more than 2 short stories to get anyone's attention. You'd need a collection. I'd say at least 4, I interjected suddenly. Sure, 4 is good. And stop submitting them to these chintzy e-zines. We can still publish the collection, but we'll likely have to buy the rights back or something. We'll see what my friend says. Just hold off for now. I gazed at her now as if she were the one thing on this earth I needed to possess, desperately and immediately. I was showing my hand too soon, but the thought of publishing this collection through one of the big boys was more than I could stand, and thus was on the urge of blowing early. You're right. Let's do this. We'll do it your way. Anything you say. She looked now as if she'd grown impatient with my presence. I think we better get going, Vanessa. Do you have a card? She glanced at me now with some small tithe of meaning. I fumbled around stupidly in my desk. Yeah, I used to. Probably have 1 or 2 lying around here somewhere. I continued muttering like that until I came up with a deteriorated piece of paper that had once been my business card. Here it is. I handed it to her, and she immediately turned and walked out. This is great. I think things are looking up, Nessie said as she crossed the room to kiss my forehead before turning and chasing her companion out of the room. I sat for hours as if I were glued to the spot. I couldn't get this newcomer, this beautiful intruder off my mind. Nessie obviously paled in comparison to her friend in the looks department, and it seemed Sasha came from slightly better breeding and had perhaps access to a higher social strata. Most importantly, she didn't seem the type who talked about lizard people or how the earth was flat as my cutting board, though I wondered if Nessie often broached these subjects with her as she did with me. Within a few hours, the text message had come through. It's Sasha. Was really impressed with your new direction. Would like to learn more. Having a friend over for dinner. He's an agent looking to take on new clients. Let's see if you're a fit. Maybe you could bring some fresh material to show. We could have a little fun too. She ended it with a time and an address. I replied simply saying that I'd be there. While I was beyond myself with terrifying excitement, at the same time, her dreaded words from earlier, at least 4 stories, rung in my ears. The fact of it was, I knew that at the time, there was only one way I'd get 2 more stories written. I needed fresh material, something I hadn't submitted anywhere yet, and I knew I had nothing. As I watched the clock tick away towards the appointed time, I knew what my destiny would be. I thought to myself, if I just listen, there's no harm in it. Even if I write it down, nothing becometh of it. I just need to avoid submitting it to a publisher. It's just for this one guy, this one agent to read privately. And whether I listen to the story or not, whether I write it down or not, whoever is out there doing this, the butcher of Buffalo, will still take their pound of flesh. There couldn't possibly be any connection other than mere coincidence between my decisions to listen to this or not and the occurrences of the murders. However, once having published these stories, that's where it all led back to me in the most unthinkable manner, whereby I might be falsely accused with no way to explain away what would be in plain sight for all the world to see. In the end, I doubt whether any of these rationalizations actually influenced me one way or the other. I had a date, and I needed to impress her, and so I was going to do what was necessary. There could be no other possible outcome. I grimly dragged my body over to the laptop, sat down and double-clicked on the onion icon. When I had logged into the site, I was again greeted by the timer, which was almost up. There were more in the audience than usual, a head count of nearly 500. And as the timer ran out, the last 4 members joined before the screen lit up with the name Asmodeus for episode 665 of the podcast, which he revealed was titled Thieve Come Die. Albeit by how he said the word come, I could tell it wasn't the typical spelling as in come here, but rather a 3-letter word. Before beginning, he mentioned that at the end of the next show, there would be important revelations exclusively for their most devoted fans. This story concerned a man who worked construction and did handyman jobs on the side. He was always hustling and made good money, but he had married up to a woman who expected the finest of things. In order to keep up with the Joneses, his resourcefulness was put to the test. Whether it was dumpster diving for antiques or picking up scrap metal off the curb for extra cash, his side gigs were innumerable. But the constant work and hustle kept him away from home, and he'd begun to suspect that his wife was becoming unfaithful, with endless opportunities for adultery given the current state of affairs. She was, after all, a beautiful woman with charm and class, and these qualities were the reason he had proposed to her in the first place. But of late, he'd begun to wonder just why exactly she had agreed to the union from her part, given that she constantly berated him about not having money and not being able to have or do anything. These complaints had gradually waxed into full-on frontal attacks, which sought to demean and spoil his manhood. In a fit of desperation, he'd found himself preparing to do what was once the unthinkable. He stretched a balaclava over his face and pried a ground-floor window that had been left unlocked with a crowbar. Inside the quiet and dark house, he had found jewelry, cash, electronics, and the latest video game consoles, which he stuffed greedily into his duffel bag. Later on at the pawn shop, it was the easiest $2,000 he'd ever made with no questions asked. He immediately spent the money on a diamond ring to replace the measly gemstone that had been used in the engagement. That night in the bedroom, he was rewarded for his efforts in ways he never thought possible. Now he was hooked. The first case had been kiddie stuff in comparison to what was to come, He honed his art and craft by learning to pick locks and acquiring all the tools of a thief's trade. After 4 more jobs, each generating greater revenue than the last, he was able to put a down payment on the latest Tesla, another gift for the woman at home who never even deigned to ask where this newfound money was coming from. With this new income also came a new lifestyle. He and the wife began throwing parties where champagne and cocaine flowed like a river in a blizzard. The orgiastic splendors and swinging from partner to partner was now even not enough to satiate him or his wife. One day when he got home from work, his wife was packing her suitcase. Their newly acquired friends were going to Vegas for a weekend of debauchery and splendor, and she told him that she would be going as well, either with him or without him. He knew what this meant. If he didn't come up with the money for the hotels, the gambling, the drinks, and the parties, she'd be going on the arm of another man. In that moment, he made up his mind that the jobs he'd been doing were not cutting it. He needed a bigger heist. He knew just the place. Out in Orchard Park, he'd heard of a place where the security was lax and the payoff disproportionately large. There lived a single 30-something woman who came from generational wealth and was big in the world of art collecting. It was rumored that inside the mansion were original Blakes, Picassos, and Gauguins, and more. The crowning jewel was a sculpture rumored to have been carved in ancient Greece, something which should have been in a museum and was considered by many in the art world to be priceless. As he stood outside the door, obscured from view by the bushes that surrounded the foundation, he had some second thoughts. He'd already tried the door handle and found it unlocked. He'd cracked the door open and observed the all-too-quiet darkness. Nothing with such high reward should come so easy, he thought to himself. But as his dear wife's words and expressions rung in his mind, the path forward to take came into focus. He crept along the plush carpets, his footfalls as subtle as a church mouse. On the ground floor, he filled his bag with expensive silver, with golden gem-studded trinkets, and Hermes and Gucci bags worth tens of thousands of dollars. His eyes salivated at the rich fare which his thieving hands bit into with savoriness. After a while he paused, realizing that he'd been distracted and carried away by the insignificant plunder in front of him. The insider who'd given him the information had related that the art gallery was on the 2nd floor, the master bedroom being an anteroom to the said gallery. He set his bag by the door and began creeping up the stairs with several large trash bags that would cover the paintings and statues for the purposes of transportation. On the 2nd floor landing, the hallway led clearly to double doors which must have been the threshold of the master bedroom, where riches beyond his wildest imagination did lie. As he cracked open those double doors, which gave way without the least resistance, he could almost feel those paintings in his hand, could almost smell his wife's sweat as he held her breasts in the Vegas penthouse suite. Inside the dark room, he could see a grand oak door on the opposite wall, which must needs be the entrance into this private and exclusive gallery that held all the gold of Solomon. His skeleton was nearly bursting from its skin encasement with excitement as he tiptoed across the carpet. However, when only halfway to the goalpost, he noticed something untoward. In the 4-poster bed against the wall there lay a woman, wide awake, sitting up as she stared at him in perfect silence. As he looked back in horror, he soon realized that the look on her face was one verging on amusement rather than mortal terror. As the two stared one another down in silence, the woman, whose full-breasted nakedness gleamed in the moonlight, at length opened her lips and spoke in a soft voice. "I see you've let yourself in, and help yourself to the buffet. Now that the main course has been had, it feels more like an appetizer. You greedy boy. Now you've gone in search of some dessert, my chunky little monkey." The thief, caught completely off guard, was unable to speak. He merely stared back through the eye holes of the balaclava. "That's okay," she filled the void he had left hanging in the air. "You're not the type for witty repartee, I get it. I'm not much for small talk either. That's okay. I like my men that way. The strong, silent type." She folded the comforter of the bed down, revealing more of her nakedness from the waist down. "Now, I've had enough talk as well. Let's see what type of man of action you really are. Maybe then I'll show you around the gallery. And let the greedy boy have his treat." His eyes veered from the naked body in front of him to the stoic oak door of the gallery, and then mentally to the door behind him, his only escape should he choose the route of the coward. He knew that one must slay a dragon to take its gold. As his wife's insults ricocheted between his ears, he told himself that he was no coward. His mind was made up. His course was already set. As he marched towards the bed with an awkward sort of confidence, the mysterious woman laughed a deep, throaty chuckle. He jumped onto the bed, by now ravenous with the idea of the easy piece of ass that had merely fallen into his lap. But he wasn't a complete buffoon either. As he mounted her, he suddenly grabbed her wrists, pinning them to the wall as he uttered in a low, harsh voice, "You're not trying to get out of this robbery, are you? You'll let me leave with the loot? You're gonna let me get some? And you won't call the cops? Unbelievable. What's the catch?" Despite her compromised position, she appeared unmoved as she let out another long chuckle. "My dear, what you see here is only a fraction of my possessions. My wealth goes beyond your wildest imagination. If you had some kerosene, I'd let you torch the place now with everything inside, just to prove the point." She ripped her wrists out of his hands with surprising strength and dexterously pulled him in, smashing her lips into his and helping him to tear off his clothes simultaneously. As the pair tossed and turned in the sheets, first one and then the other taking the dominant position, the thief could think and fantasize only of his wife, who was the one thing he could never fully have, the one thing he would always be chasing, but never quite possessing. As he writhed with pleasure, he knew that final live-long moment of climax was on the horizon. The full culmination of his most insidious binge of intercourse was nigh. But just as these pulsations began to emanate through his lower half, he noticed something unusual. It had become difficult to retract from the penetration, and increasingly so with time, even to the point that it was now painful and that once pleasure-filled friction was now unattainable. He found himself confusedly climaxing in a lackluster manner, as the searing pain of what he was experiencing in the nether regions increased in intensity. What he had failed to realize until this moment now became clear as the woman beneath him let out another low and deep chuckle, that this time sounded more like a growl. There were appendages of some kind, razor sharp, facing inwards and at an angle that dug more into his flesh, the harder he pulled and tried to retract himself. He could feel the slipperiness of the blood that now exuded out as the incisors sunk into his flesh, and in a panic, he understood what would happen if he pulled or struggled any harder. In the meantime, the woman beneath him seemed to be swelling and increasing in girth in the most monstrous manner, her once petite frame now bulging at the seams. Before he could think of a cunning escape plan, what he dreaded most came into full fruition as those incisors chomped down, tearing clean through the flesh and consuming it in whole, as it revealed which end was the true mouth of this creature. Its appetite now whetted, a tentacle-like proboscis now emerged from the crevice and inserted itself into the gaping hole it had just produced in the man's loins, swelling and ejecting incisors from its flanks to embed itself irreversibly. As he screamed a blood-curdling cry, it began pumping and sucking at his flesh, consuming his blood and bodily fluids. He let out one final cry as his desiccated, wrinkled, thin as paper flesh began to be sucked into the now enormous gaping jaws and crushed, bite after bite. When it was done eating, it let out a belch that could be heard across Lake Erie. By the end of this story, I was feeling quite ill. I'd been so engrossed that I again missed the fact that I was now the only one left in the portal with the hosts, and I quickly X'd out of my browser and pulled up the word processor, wasting no time in getting to work. I sat typing for hours, racing against the clock as I plumbed my memory to include every word that Asmodeus had spoken with the highest degree of fidelity. As I finally sat in front of the finished product, doing a quick once-over edit, I noticed that it was now time to be heading over to Sasha's place for the promised introduction. I printed the draft out and jumped into my car, not daring to waste any more time since I knew it may take a few minutes to find the address she'd sent, which was in a part of town I wasn't the most familiar with. As I drove, I could sense the energy of the manuscript, which lay in the passenger seat, as if it were somehow radioactive. When I arrived, I found a tall, 4-story, modernized Victorian with a wraparound porch over in the Elmwood area. As I got out, with a bouquet of flowers that I'd picked up on the way over in one hand and my manuscript in the other, a group of young hipsters or skaters or both passed me on the sidewalk, eyeing me sarcastically. I heard them laughing as they passed, and I made my way up to the porch. This was the part of the city that was filled with the gatekeepers of mine art, the cutting edge of the intellectual class. After knocking, I was greeted with an exceptionally long wait in which I served as the spectacle for more college-aged hipsters and activists who strolled by, not occasionally observing my person with a snicker or a nod. Finally, an end to this suffering was achieved as the door creaked open, and the cutting figure of Sasha appeared from out of the darkness of the foyer. "So, you did come after all. We were wondering whether you'd show." I gulped, rather shocked at the most crude welcome I'd ever experienced. However, deep down, I knew what I should have expected from the spoiled brat of a millionaire publishing dynasty. "Yeah, well," I stuttered out in response, "I've managed to write something new. Something radioactive. I couldn't store it at my place. I need someone to take it from me." At this, she looked unmistakably intrigued as she stared down at the manuscript before her eyes wryly moved to the bouquet in my other hand. "Oh, how delightfully old-fashioned. And awkward, to be sure. That's wonderful. I didn't know that people even did stupid shit like this anymore. Well, thanks. I'll throw them in a vase. Come on in." My heart sank as I followed her inside, and she dismissively disappeared into another room without another word, as if I hadn't even been there in their house. Soon after, I heard loud conversation, punctuated by grotesque bouts of derisive laughter. With a heavy heart, I slowly shuffled towards the sounds of alacrity. I emerged into a brilliantly lit dining room with a grand dining table and numerous chairs on all sides. The host was sitting at the head of the table while this supposed literary agent was at the opposite end. Myself, apparently forgotten for the time being, served almost the role of the ghost who arrives late to the dinner party, not understanding the fact that he died in a car crash on the way over, who marvels over the affrighted glares of the attendees on seeing his grisly and mangled appearance before them. I broke the silence by awkwardly clearing my throat, whereupon they continued their conversation as if I hadn't even been there. I noticed the bouquet of flowers carelessly tossed in the kitchen sink, which was barely visible from the dining room. As I helped myself to a seat at the table, orthogonal to the other two, I surveyed the so-called literary agent who sat to my left-hand side. The man was bespectacled, bald, middle-aged, dressed in an expensive but fashionable suit. He spoke with a highly affected air. His politics were highly predictable. His sense of style was so avant-garde, so modern, so posh, so dated. I knew right away he wouldn't like me, and I sure didn't like him much. As their banter waned, during which time I sat silently while my eyes bounced like ping-pong balls from one speaker to the other, I noticed the man's eyes rest firmly on the manuscript, which I had placed conspicuously on the table. He looked at me directly for the first time over the top rim of his glasses. "So, you're the author of Blood Sex, is it? It's got a ring to it. But how does one innovate in the horror genre? Do you mind?" He held his hand out, signaling for the manuscript, which I shoved across the table towards him. "Yeah," I said to him. "It'll be published next week. Maybe you should read it and find out." By now I could tell nothing I said even registered. I watched his eyes bouncing around the page as he skimmed through it. "Thief, come die," he whispered to himself. I looked over at Sasha, who seemed completely unaware that the entire exchange was occurring, her face buried deep in her cell phone as her thumbs furiously texted. He says as he places the manuscript down, staring off into space. "You've already finished it?" I asked in a perturbed tone. "I've seen enough to know the measure of the man as an author." Sasha looked up from her phone now. "What'd you make of it?" she asked him in a manner that indicated curiosity piqued. It was clear she longed to discover someone. "I simply loved it." As he uttered those words, my own jaw nearly dropped slack with surprise. On the other hand, those weren't exactly my words on the page. So go figure. Only it reads too much like a cautionary tale rather than evil for its own sake. I can see the direction, only perhaps we're not quite there yet. I knew there would be a catch. There always was when you were dealing with a critic. "I see," I muttered before Sasha cut in excitedly. "You haven't seen anything yet. Blood Sex is a revelation. He's also got... what's the name of it again?" "I'm working on something new, actually," I said mysteriously. "If you thought you'd seen it all, this one will really knock you out of your seat, my friend." He stared at me as if I were the most insignificant creature that had ever crossed his path. "Charmed, I'm sure. When you've finished it, send it my way. I think we can work something out. If you've got the stamina for a full-length novel. Sasha, wonderful as always. You're such a doll. I've got to be on my way now." Sasha stood to escort him out. I overheard him in the foyer. "Darling, I'm sorry to leave you with this boorish fellow in there." As she returned, the next great difficulty dawned on me. The part of the evening I hadn't even thought about or expected. The point that we'd be left alone. "Well," says Sasha as she sits down, this time directly across from me, pouring herself another glass of wine. "So glad he didn't stay. He's such a bore, you know? Would you like a glass of wine? My thoughts temporarily drifted towards Nessie. Incidentally, I just as quickly tore any such thoughts or considerations from my being. If Sasha could truly catapult my career, as her actions seemed to promise, a night's infidelity was certainly a price to pay that I could stomach. Wasn't it obvious that seeking this kind of affirmation for my already plagiarized works of art was something beyond a deal with the devil? I was truly pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be a bad actor, and so I indulged in the sweet confections of night. The wine flowed as the night dragged on. We danced. We told stories from the halcyon days of yore. We fell into each other's arms in comfort and in our wickedness. Finally, she pulled out a bag of white powder and cut up some lines on the dining room table. After that, the night passed at warp speed. We went out on the town. We hit all the hottest clubs. And as the night wound down to the last call, we hit the necessary dives that everyone migrated to early in the morning before dawn. Everything became a blur. The last thing I recalled was stumbling out of the Uber and going up to Sasha's bedroom. She had her hand down my pants before we even made it to the bed. Though a fleeting thought of Nessie popped into view, the inertia of what had already transpired was unstoppable. There was no going back. When I awoke, I immediately turned my head and let out a spray of vomit that mostly ejected out of my nose. I stumbled over to the sink and began sucking directly from the faucet while simultaneously attempting to force water up my nostrils to cleanse my sinuses of the vomit. During this undertaking, it occurred to me that I was now standing in my own apartment. "Oh no," I muttered as I clawed at my mind to penetrate the thick fog of the blackout, the lost hours that had found me back in my own residence. But it was impossible. There was nothing there to recall. I looked over at the clock and saw that it was now 2 in the afternoon. My eyes were reluctantly drawn over to the laptop. It was open and powered on. I typed in the password and watched as the screen exploded in front of my eyes that were still not adjusted. The web browser was open to my email. My worst fears were confirmed even before I clicked on the thread with the email from the magazine. I had submitted the latest story to them. They'd paid me out $3,000, an unheard of sum. I pulled up my bank account and saw that it had already been wired. No, I muttered to myself as I raced over to the couch and flipped the television on. Before I could enunciate my worst fears, I saw the red and blue lights behind the reporter, who stood in front of the 4-story Victorian off Elmwood Avenue. Sasha had been brutally murdered. The reporter mentioned that there was evidence of sexual assault. In my condition at the time, it was finally too much to bear. I fainted. I awoke in the state of a half-dream, where the angel that had been standing over me had followed me into the waking realm. As my eyes adjusted to the new state of the world of light before me, the halo of light and the blessed angel's face gradually warped and contorted into that of Nessie. My head was in her lap and she was stroking my cheek as if my absence over the past few weeks had only made her grow fonder of me. It occurred to me in that moment that she really cared. I should be alone in that moment as I wake. I should miserably and permanently be alone. That cantankerous fool who takes everyone around him for granted. But yet, there she was. She'd let herself in again and found me in a dire state. Seeing this, she had taken upon herself to sacrifice her day, her time, to nurse me back to health. It was an idea so simple yet so insanely difficult for me to grasp. All I could do was ponder why. Why did she so care? Why did she deflect the insults as if she wore an armor of love? Love? The word felt so sour on my tongue as if its presence there was something foreign, rotten, unpalatable to the extreme. But that was it. I finally understood. She loved me. Now just what the hell was I going to do with that information? I'd made such a mess of things that I could hardly see any way back. As I fully came back into the world, I noticed that Nessie had tears in her eyes as I sat up suddenly, surprising her. You're okay. When I found you, I feared the worst. I don't know what's going on anymore. Sasha? Her voice trembled and broke with emotion. I stared at her with a dark emptiness. Yes, I heard. She began weeping and threw herself into my arms. I just don't understand why or how. I know that violence is on the rise in the city, but this feels like something else. Something out of the movies. A serial killer in Buffalo? That just shouldn't happen, and not to someone like Sasha. And you were with her last night. I'm sure that the blood drained from my face now as I awaited what must be the ultimate accusation. Yes, I muttered plainly. Yes, She broke in. Oh my God. Did you see anything? Anyone suspicious lurking outside her house? Maybe with yellow, slit-like eyes? Any strange or unexplained noises in the night? The poor thing put all the faith of a saint in me. She didn't ask if anything happened between Sasha and I, or if, more terribly, I was responsible for the crime. I responded with silence. Wait, you don't know, do you? How they found her? They say the blood was drained from her body. The killer painted portraits with her blood on the walls. There were buckets of it. I finally found not strength, but the willingness to wade up to the neck in my own insufferable secrets no longer. Nessie, I've got to tell you something. What is it? Her eyes were wide. She was truly alert now with anticipation. I lost heart in that moment. Maybe we should go out and get some air. Get a drink or something. I'm not feeling that well. I think it would do us both good. We ended up at a bar down by the docks, sitting by the water at the canal side. I watched a pair of kayakers, lovers no doubt, pedal by, splashing one another playfully as I sipped my Bloody Mary. At times, what one would give to trade places. Nessie stared at me over the brim of her Long Island iced tea, still silently awaiting, full of expectation, but too mannerly, too caring to interrupt my daydreams with an impatient query. I only saw now, as her hair blew and furled with the wind off the ocean's surface, how majestical a creature she actually was. This quality was elusive in her, like the Cheshire cat's smile, yet when found, when experienced, one found it a treasure worth venturing out into the unknown, maybe treacherous lands after. Finally, understanding this fact, I couldn't keep the charade going on any longer. I opened up and let the dam break under a deluge. Nessie. She nearly exploded with impatience now as I paused. You know the butcher, the killer out there. I think I know who it is. Oh my God, she uttered now, making a face as if she'd just eaten something rotten. You're not going to tell me it's you, are you? The fact that she could ask me something like this so calmly, without shrinking away in horror, gave me even more confidence that a special sort of entity did sit across from me. No, Nessie. She let out an overdue sigh of relief. Not exactly, but somehow I'm involved, or responsible. I don't know exactly. I saw her eyes fill with tears for the second time that day, her voice again breaking as she choked out. Oh my God, I'm so confused. Why are you saying these things? I reached across the table, squeezing her shoulders, as I always did to calm her down. Nessie, just listen. I'll explain everything, from the beginning. And so I proceeded to do just that in excruciating detail, from the dark web forum, the plagiarized stories, and their relationships to the murders. As I spoke, I watched as the poor creature appeared to go through the 5 stages of grief. And damn it, she was just on the verge of acceptance when I had to do the following. So you're not involved then. It's whoever these people are, the ones running the podcast, perhaps with yellow slit-like eyes. Nessie, all the evidence will point to me. I knew 2 of the victims, and I've blacked out and can't account for my whereabouts on the night that each of them were killed. The police will have a field day once my stories come out, or Sasha's agent friend there points them in my direction. Whichever comes first. Lord knows I must have been one of the last people to see her. Nessie stared at me with a puzzled look. Wait a second, she said. What were you doing alone with Sasha all night anyways? My brow lowered, my whole face tensed up. Nessie, that's the one question I wish you'd never asked me. Because I can't lie to you anymore. I won't. I refuse to. You deserve so much better than me. And so I must have you know that whatever the worst thing you can imagine is, that's exactly what we did. The unthinkable. I could see that the shot had gone straight through her heart. The poor thing looked as if she might crumple onto the floor and die on the spot. So bewildered was she, so shocked, so injured, that the true portrait of her in that moment surely defies description. The closest I can get you would be The Scream by Edvard Munch, or perhaps one of Pollock's darker works diminished into endless fractals of angst and pain, just as I thought she might crumble or vaporize completely into human dust in front of me. It seemed she had weathered the worst of that storm. My goddess of eternal strength, I thought to myself as I watched this Herculean feat of human patience and understanding. I vowed on the spot that never again would I stain her image with the appellation and prefix of messy. What sort of narcissistic beast had I been all this time? It didn't mean anything, she muttered quietly. That's what matters. You didn't feel anything for her. No, I reaffirmed her suspicion bluntly. We don't have to talk about it again, she offered, as if it were already a thing of the past to be repressed, forgotten forever, as if it had never happened at all. And honestly, wasn't it better this way? But we do have to talk about these stories you've been writing, she said with finality, as if she were again lecturing me, the schoolboy who'd gotten his greedy hands into the cookie jar. She continued, You must never listen to the podcast again. You must never plagiarize anything again. Or if you do, I don't think I'll be able to look at you the same. The past is the past. But now, you have a choice, and you have all the facts. You explain them to me with such beautiful clarity yourself. So? I stared at her with indecision. I'd come so far at this point that I didn't quite know whether I could stop if I tried. With a sudden turn of heart, I stammered, Nessie, I don't know how to put this in the simplest way possible, but you don't control me. I need to understand what's going on here and where this is all headed. You can't just open Pandora's box and then simply close it. I started this whole thing and I need to find a way to end it, one way or another. They say that in the next story, there will be revelations. Nessie looked at me in horror. It's just another trick. Are you so blind? The same thing that happened the past 3 times will happen again. We are dealing with forces beyond our understanding, beyond our influence or control. Just what is your goal with all this plagiarism? This game that's taken 3 lives already? I felt a black wave wash over my heart as the most insidious shadows crept out from my inmost being, bridling at the provocations thrown. What is my goal? Eventually, I'd like to be reviled as the Marquis de Sade of our age, and in so doing, become the begrudging spirit of our times, as every de Sade has been throughout history. That evil man who walks among you, saying the things that you think shouldn't be said, and living a life ruthlessly detestable, but consummately all its own. The tears came again as her lips now shivered with pain, as her voice gradually rose into a primal shout. I knew you could never take me seriously, not even for a moment. This is no joke. My friend is dead, murdered. Don't you understand that? Will you allow another to die for your fraudulent writing career? I loved you. I really loved you. That's the sad part. She stormed away from the table and left me swilling the nearly empty cocktail in front of me as I attempted to brush off the awkward stares from the surrounding tables. I hadn't tried to stop her. It was better that way. Let her tear the likes of me out of her heart. She deserves better. I stared out at the breaking waves, the pigeons soaring through the air, and the boats with their millionaire owners zipping about. I knew that it was only a matter of time before my stories would get noticed by this or that detective or private investigator, and the SWAT team would be surrounding my door. That's what Nessie didn't comprehend. I had come too far to go back, and no matter what the consequences were, the only way out was forward. As the waitress passed, I ordered a dirty martini and told her to keep them coming. I needed some liquid courage. Back at my place, I pressed the power button and watched the monitor flash into existence. My mouse hovered over the onion icon as mortal dread overwhelmed me. I knew that if I stared too long into an abyss, that it would stare back into me. I was on the precipice of a dark canyon. Would I throw myself in just to plummet's depths? I double-clicked on the icon and watched as the 4 podcasts erupted onto my screen with a timer nearly at 0. Who was I kidding? There was no choice in the matter. The name Sonielin flashed across the screen. He reaffirmed the coming revelations at the end of the episode, but also announced that this likely would be the last episode on this forum for some time, but that the location of future meeting places would be forthcoming to those who qualified. I shuddered as he announced the name of episode number 666, The Dragon's Asshole. The tale concerned a man with an intellectual bent. He lived for books, for literature, for science and philosophy. His intellectual pursuits were something of an art for him, and he considered his model of the universe to be roughly complete. This was all good and well, except that he had fallen in love with a passionate woman with many rogue appetites for the vague and mysterious. The two were a constant parable of yin and yang, at loggerheads on every subject, finding it impossible to find the slightest common ground. While he was ardent and consummate, perhaps militant of an atheist, she indulged in all the world's religions, finding comfort and serenity in the wisdom of her ancestors and their teachings. Despite this, he was determined to fix her, to win her over to his side, so to speak, the side of rationality, of modernity itself. He sought to free her from the shackles of her ideas, which were a hangover from the Dark Ages, and to pull her into his reality of logic and facts by wiping the scales from her eyes. One evening they sat enjoying a glass of wine by the fire. As the romance of the moment waned due to his predilection for lecturing her, the subject swung towards the realm of the supernatural, a place it had gone many times in the past with unfruitful outcomes. But how can you know for certain there's nothing else out there? How do you know for a fact that God doesn't exist? She asked him. How can I know there's nothing? That's asking me to prove a negative. Factually speaking, I can only prove and provide evidence for the observable. But that means you don't know. Don't you see that means you don't know? How can you believe that your limited human mind is the most powerful thing in the universe? You know that Einstein believed in God. Do you know more than he? Are you better than all your ancestors who believed? Einstein, the guy who denied quantum theory because God didn't play dice with the universe? How well did that statement age? I swear, she said to him, no matter what I say, you always have some smart remark to come back with. You have all the answers. You know just what to say. I can never be right about anything, can I? You just have boundless energy to contradict me. Don't get upset just because it makes sense to you, and you're forced to accept it. Forced to accept it? Look, belief is not so simple as forced. I'm swayed by the stories of those who crossed over to the other side and came back. They report bright, penetrating lights, a feeling of acceptance by some otherworldly beings, and most of all, a life-changing understanding of the forces outside of our understanding. Oh, come on. This is too easy. Have you never heard of DMT? Released from the pineal gland, causes us to hallucinate as we shuffle off this mortal coil. Hallmarks are bright lights, feelings of talking to a being from another dimension, and so on. This explains afterlife experiences, alien abductions, demonic possessions, you name it. So you're so sure that chemical reactions in the brain are responsible for otherworldly visions. Why don't you put your money where your mouth is? Babe, what are you suggesting? I hope it's not what I think it is. Listen, if you think chemicals will give us the all-divine experience, why don't we try it? On a wager. I wager that the divine is something real, something unreplicable, and you wager that you can simulate it with chemistry. She disappeared into the anteroom, and a sound of rustling around could be heard. When she returned, she sat back down on the couch next to him and snuggled up under the blanket. After raising her hand, she allowed a small baggie to unravel, which revealed twisted and dried-seeming plant matter. But he knew at once what it was. Fungus among us. Psilocybin. He felt something sink into the pit of his stomach as he observed the strange, twisting alien forms of the mushrooms. No way, he said in a timorous voice, being one so stringently logical and rational that his whole life to this point he had refused to ingest any hallucinogenic substance that would alter his mind. She smiled a mischievous smile, being one experienced in these dark arts. What? Don't you believe in your own theory enough to test it? Here's how much I believe in mine. She opened the bag and allowed 3 or 4 stems to fall into her hand before tossing them into her mouth, crunching them, and washing it down with some water from the side table. No, Don't do. His words came too late. Come on, don't be such a tight ass. Live a little. I'm here. I'll be your spotter. What's the fear? I fear nothing but fear itself, he muttered back. Some spotter you'll be when you're zonked out staring at the wall like it's the theater screen. Chicken. I guess I'm more of a man than you are. By the way, whoever loses has to do the dishes for a month, she said lazily as she slumped down a bit into the couch, preparing herself for what was to come. Really? So now we're resorting to insulting my manhood. Alright, fine. You win. I'll play your little game, and you better get ready for some raisin hands because you know I'm right. She handed him the baggie and watched as he inverted the bag into his mouth and chomped down the 4 remaining stems before grabbing a glass of wine and swilling it down. Oh my, that was gross. She laughed. Come on now, just relax. You're gonna feel a little bit sick to your stomach at first. Maybe a little nauseous, but don't worry. It will pass. This too shall pass. Then the fun starts. Oh, just what the hell did you get me into? He slouched back, resting his legs on top of hers as he nervously prepared himself mentally for the worst. The tension all the while building in his chest as he regretfully resigned himself to his uncertain destiny for the night. In the meantime, his wife had pulled out her phone and begun playing trippy, psychedelic music on her Bose speakers, as must have been her ritual. As the foreign rhythms and beats of the music shook the air around him with bass, the room seemed to tremble and shake, rise and fall with the cadence of the symphonic chords. He looked over at his wife and found that her face had changed in a very subtle manner. There was now an unmistakable, feline-esque quality to the structure of her mouth and nose. The undoubted third eye on her forehead did not help matters any. This isn't right, he muttered. Something's gone wrong. She looked at him quizzically and said a half-hearted, Everything is okay, dear. You're fine. As she began to nod off with the glass of wine still in her hand, slumping to the point that a few drops spilled on the blanket, while the tears of wine dripped down the opposite side of the glass. As he looked into the brick facade of the fireplace, he noticed now a small pinhole that he was sure hadn't been there before. He now wished that he could doze off as his wife seemed intent on doing, but he was wide awake. He couldn't will the forces of drowsiness to enter into his being, as instead adrenaline rushed through his veins. His pupils had become like pinholes themselves. He squinted his eyes as he strained to overcome the tides of the music, which washed over him, took possession of him in strange fashion, as if it were probing his inner being and mystery, and then receded just as quickly, which left him feeling raped by an alien presence. The one thing he had to understand was that pinhole in the brick facade, a perfectly circular black hole which had now grown wider to the diameter of a marble. He stood, grabbing his wife's wineglass, which was on the verge of slipping out of her hand, and setting it on the side table, before cautiously approaching the slowly dying fire in the hearth. He could have sworn that the hole was growing larger, extending its margins by the second. He squatted down, staring into that hole, straining his eyes. He turned on his cell phone flash and attempted to shine the light into the hole, but it remained obscured as if nothing could be elucidated within. His hand shook uncontrollably as he reached his index finger towards that hole, stopping just short of touching it. He hesitated slightly, before sighing and finally fingering the hole with his nail. As he did so, the entire facade ruptured as a massive crack spread out from that narrow point, causing a wrinkle in the fabric of the hearth. As he backed away in terror, before he could react further, the crack shook and then split further apart, the floor under his feet even quaking under the force of it. All the while, the psychedelic music was overlaid atop these physical impossibilities. In the last, he turned and observed his wife, her cat-like countenance, still snoozing on the couch, before the gaping void sucked him in entirely. He stumbled forward through the fog, finding himself in the midst of what seemed a most unusual graveyard in the thick of night. The tombstones rose like twisted crags from the dry, desolate ground, where they were engraved with strange, ancient symbols. In the distance, across the expanse of a bridge of rock which billowed with steam spanning over an illimitable canyon, he watched a lamb that was in the process of crossing. He cautiously followed, constantly veering his eyes at all points of the clock as he moved forward into this unknown world. He strained his eyes, seeking out for his wife, praying that this illusion would fade even partly, and that he could find his way back to the realm from which he'd left, but it was all to no avail. He placed one foot in front of the other as he crossed the narrow rock bridge, with both arms outstretched as if he were walking a tightrope. He could feel the steam hot on his skin, causing him to go faster as the flesh of his forearms began to turn red and blister. Once across, the lamb had gained on him. There was a gate with stairs leading down into the earth at the edge of what seemed a reedy bog, with deformed, twisting plants and boiling water. He watched as the lamb stepped through the gate and began descending the stairs, until it had gone out of view. As he stared down into the unfathomable darkness those stairs descended into, he felt the terror sink densely into his bones. But there was no place else to go, and he understood this at some level. Somewhere deep down inside of him there was a voice, a small whisper that wanted to cry out for help, for salvation, but to whom? He stayed silent as he began to descend the stairs haltingly. He eventually got the hang of the stairs, their dimensions and their spacing, and he was able to move faster. However, it seemed that he was walking for miles. His exhaustion was growing. His legs were burning, aching fiercely as he began to fear that the staircase was but a never-ending illusion, and that even turning back might prove impossible. This notion was dispelled as after unknown hours, he saw a dim light illuminating the stone slabs of the staircase from below. He dragged himself down faster now, even though his limbs were on the verge of collapse. He reminded himself that time, space, and perception of all natural fields can be distorted by these chemicals, and that when he came down from this high, he would be perfectly content on the couch to merely fall asleep after boasting his victory of the wager to his wife. Naturally, believing that this light from below was the way out, he looked forward to passing his wife in the kitchen on the nights to come. As she scrubbed the dishes, he might say to her, looks like you missed a spot on that plate, or, the silver still has some water stains, honey. Can you rinse it again? I like to see my reflection while I'm eating. But things would not be so simple. As he neared the illumination, he noted that the walls of the corridor he was descending into were carved with strange and mandala forms that made him feel uneasy, even nauseous as he let his eyes run over their circular and fractal configurations. The strange feelings and the vertigo began to swell and overwhelm him, causing a delirium of sorts. Beyond these stairs, he found flat ground that opened up into a vaulted room whose ceiling was so high it wasn't immediately visible. With torches lighting the place with a flickering glow from some unseen vantage point high above. In the middle of the chamber there was a raised platform. A woman laid upon it. He recognized almost immediately that this was his wife. She wore a white gown that looked exactly like her wedding dress from the day of their blissful union of yin and yang. She looked porcelain, beautiful, celestial. The chamber was otherwise quite bare, other than two large statues on opposite walls that were in line with the raised platform and his sleeping wife. The statues were of a demonic figure, with eyes closed, on one side a male, on the other side its twin, a female. He began to gain heart. The chemical substance must be losing its peak action. He had at least returned to the point that he saw his wife, who was sleeping lazily on the couch next to him in reality. He expected that at any moment the fireplace might come into view, which was currently being symbolized by the torches high above. But it didn't happen quickly enough, and he knew that he couldn't stand in this murky, obscene chamber just waiting any longer, for the mind would continue to play its tricks with his perceptions of time, possibly making it feel like an eternity if he did nothing. As he began to walk towards his sleeping wife, something quite awkward began to occur. He noticed that the statues themselves also seemed to be getting closer at the same rate, making them always equidistant from the platform with himself. This worrisome trend sufficed to strike him with pause. But looking at the options objectively, there seemed to be nothing else to do but ignore it. The feeling of the room shrinking with each step towards the exit was enough to make any man claw at his face ravenously. Miraculously, he was able to remain calm up to the point that he and the statues were within an arm's reach of his wife. As he reached out to touch her warm body, he noticed that the statues now too moved their arms similarly to him. Their eyes opened as if they were mirror reflections of himself. He began experimenting with this new discovery, watching as he could force the statues to make obscene or otherwise lewd gestures. This lack of respect appeared to come at a cost. Before he knew what was happening, the statues began moving autonomously and simultaneously in synchronized fashion. He attempted to step back, but found his own body now moving in synchrony with the movements of the statues, as if the relationship had now been inverted. It was they that had control of the steering wheel, and the compulsion to mimic could not be resisted. He found his hands reaching underneath the top ledge of the platform, and retracting with a large razor-sharp hook in his hand, the type used in deep-sea fishing. He watched in paralyzed terror as the statues rose their hands, while his, the one holding the hook, rose in tandem. No, 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 he groaned. The sweat dripped down his pale face as he struggled to resist. With no more ceremony, the hands of the statues came down in one foul swoop, as did his, plunging the hook deep into his wife's belly. Her eyes opened wide as the deep slumber collapsed, and she screamed in mortal pain and terror. The statues continued their mechanical destiny as they lifted and pulled, causing him to begin extracting her entrails as they emerged like sausage casings. From here, the statues took over, leaving him collapsed on the floor as they partially merged with one another and dragged the intestines around the chamber foot by foot, with the organs stretching and being strung upon the candelabras. His eyes suddenly opened back in the firelit living room. He noticed that the fire had nearly fizzled out, and the actual passage of time must have been something like an hour or slightly more than this. He was still struggling for air and hyperventilating. The effects on his physiology had certainly been real. He began laughing as he leaned back into the couch. It was a laughter of relief, of happiness, of freedom from the accustomed pain of the moment before. He wondered if he had actually won the wager or not. Certain there was nothing divine in what he had seen, but wasn't there something spiritual about it? Would this nightmare count? As he turned his head towards his wife, thinking he should wake her to tell the tale of his psychedelic journey, he saw her white, pale, trembling face, her eyes blinking in shock. Her belly was split wide open. Her intestines had been removed and now decked the walls like Christmas lights around them. He screamed as he looked down at his blood and gore-filled hands, and the world dissolved around him. As the story ended, I had found my way through 5 or 6 more shots in the meantime. I noticed again that I was the only watcher present in the podcast audience now. My eyelids became heavier than ever I had remembered them being before. As had happened for the central character of the story, the world also dissolved around me as my head slumped onto the desk. When I awoke, I already knew what I would see. I blinked reality back into focus as my crushing hangover drifted into the background. There on the screen in front of me again was the story, typed neatly, edited with perfect grammar. Behind that window was my email, where the string of sent email and responses were cataloged and the agreed upon quantity of money had already been transferred into my account. It was then, as my hand rested on the mouse, that I noticed my hand was rather slipping on the mouse pad and the tabletop. I turned around impulsively, and what I saw made me wish that I had merely drunk myself to death. There lay Nessie on the couch. Her intestines had been extracted and nailed to the walls at 4 corners. My entire body and my clothing was soaked with her blood and bodily fluids. "Oh God," I whispered, maybe actually speaking out to God in a genuine manner for the first time in decades. "What have I done?" I could still see the haunted, loving look in her death face as I stood over her body. I kneeled down and embraced her. As the tears and heartache overwhelmed me, I began to scream and curse at the top of my lungs the creatures who had dragged me into their warped existence through the podcast of the 4. "My baby, my love, my life, you were the best woman I ever knew," I cried out between heaving sobs. But then I heard the sirens, or what I at first took for sirens. As I continued to listen, it began to sound something more like an instrument of brass, of trumpets far off in the distance. I kissed Nessie on the forehead and began walking towards the door in a daze as if to attempt to hear this new sound more clearly. As I opened the door to the street, there stood a horse, beautiful and wan, glistening, stamping its feet, staring at me with its cold, dead eyes. I know that it is waiting for me. As I walk completely naked and covered in blood towards it, it neighs softly in affirmation of our fates. I grab its mane and lift myself onto its back. From this new height, I see ahead of me in the distant fog a white, a red, and a black horse with riders mounted waiting for me. I can hear the Lord of the Flies whispering in my ear as a searing pain boils in my legs. My skin begins to melt and fuse with that of the horse's flanks. My skin erupts with pustules that burst with maggots as my flesh and meat coat drip away like water after a shower. Still covered in her blood, I shall ride with my brothers as the 4th seal has been broken with the 4th murder. We bring to you not the apocalypse of old, but one fitting our modern era. The first rides a white horse, and he brings with him addiction. Addiction to TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. Addiction to heroin, crystal meth, painkillers. Addiction to fast food, Tinder, and OnlyFans. The second rides a red horse and brings with him elitism. The elitism of the mainstream media, the globalist, and the political classes. The elitism of the popular kids and the in-crowds, the hierarchies of the apes, where the will to power reigns supreme. The third rider is on a black horse. He brings with him the greed and materialism of our age. Not only political corruption on a global scale, but the YouTube financial gurus and crypto bros, the affiliated marketing, multi-level marketing, the sponsorships and the Ponzi schemes, the hype beasts and the meme stocks, the Wall Street bets, the crypto zoos, and the FTX. Lastly, I ride the pale horse. I am your reward for seeking limitless knowledge, for holding up science as a god, the modern rejection of faith, the analysis of God, the chopping him up into tiny parts, attempting to get rid of the body, for claiming to know the unknowable. I am become death, and hell follows with me. Yeah!